lot more, study overseas. And as one IT recruitment person told me in India, it also brought a liberalization of thought, a new ways of thinking. So the rote learning and the kind of, you just do what your teacher tells you. You just learn the times tables. You just learn the heads of state and everything you need for your exam. Kind of slowly started going out the window, and it was replaced by this idea that you're allowed to question. So this recruitment guy, he works for Tata Consultancy Services, which hires, I think, at a record 1,000 students a day, graduates a day. That's their record recruitment. He told me they were Generation Y. So not Y, but WHY. The first generation that questions. And that's very weird for India. It's very strange, and it's not what my dad remembers India being, and it's not what we associate with Indian engineers. But if you think about it, if that liberalisation happened in 1991, that means we're only just now seeing the graduates of an era when they've only lived under liberalisation, when their entire lives they've only had this new way of thinking, which is partly American, partly European, this idea that they can question, they can be irreverent, and is fundamental to doing good science. So while I was at the Indian Institute of Technology, I was desperate to find any examples of this. Does this really exist? And I did, fortunately. There are students there now. There was a trend at these institutes for students to never stay on to do PhDs. They'd all leave and try and get these outsourcing IT jobs in Bangalore, well paid but very drone-like. You just stare at a screen and wait for something to happen. And now people are staying back to do PhDs, and it's much easier to do that. There are now students who are entering competitions to build robots. There's a big, across Asia, there's a Pan-Asia contest called Robocon, where you have to build a lifelike robot that can do a specific, so every year they have a specific human task they want this robot to do. And IIT Delhi have started sending teams to take part in this competition. They've also set up a club inside the campus called Technocracy, where in their spare time kids are learning MATLAB, which is an engineering computing language. They're learning to build microprocessors. So that you can see these tiny shoots of innovation happening in the education system. Small things are starting to change, where kids aren't just happy learning what they're supposed to learn and just doing the jobs that they're told to do, but actually want to think outside the box. And it was taking this journey through India that I found these small shoots of innovation all over the place. So even if Indian science isn't taking over the world now, it makes me feel, given that these shoots of innovation are happening, that like Japan, which suffered from this same kind of reputation in the 1970s, people used to say that Japanese engineers were drone-like, that they weren't innovative, that there was nothing special coming out of Japan. They changed, and India is now entering this new era, this new scientific era. So it's not just in education. The government has also made a huge commitment in science. So one of the good measures for how scientific a society is the percentage of GDP that it spends on R&D, on research and development. So generally, developing nations spend around 1%. That's Brazil, South Africa, and India at the moment. And developed, industrialized countries spend 2% or more. So US spends more than 2%, Japan spends substantially more than 2%, UK around 2%, and Germany. India has already made a commitment to enter that 2% bracket. When it does that, it will have overtaken the UK in the percentage that it spends on science, on research and development. And that is a real mark of a scientific society. Just last year, actually earlier this year, the Prime Minister announced that 2012 will be India's Year of Science, which is good for the book, but also good for India. And there are I can't talk about all the examples of exciting science that's happening in India. In the book, some of the examples I talk about are medicines being developed using open source. So collaborations between huge teams of researchers across India who don't have the resources to do what Big Pharma does by themselves, but by pooling what they do, they can do very exciting research into diseases that only affect the developing world. So the example I talk about there is tuberculosis, which you don't hear about in the West. It kills 2 Indians every 3 minutes. It's one of the biggest killers in India. Big Pharma don't care because India's poor and there's no money to be made there. So what Indian scientists are doing is pooling together their tiny bits of research and actually coming up with a solution that could lead to a new cure for tuberculosis, and they're quite confident that it will within the next few years. Another example, which is quite relevant to the Japanese nuclear plant right now, thorium reactors. India has some of the largest supplies of thorium in the world. You find it on the beaches in South India. It's very plentiful. And thorium is a nuclear fuel, almost as good as uranium, needs a little bit of extra work to get going, but much safer and much cleaner. They've already designed a new thorium-powered reactor, which is not even for India. It's designed for export. They intend to sell it to countries that need new nuclear power. And they're working on giant nuclear power stations, which will be thorium-powered and will will come online in around 2020.